Kia ora koutou, and welcome to this month's QuakeCoRE webinar, or seminar, called Charlotte Brown Toko Ingoa. So I'm a director at ResOrgs, and I'm a co-lead of IP3 within QuakeCoRE. And I'll be the chair for this month's seminar. I hope everyone survived the wild weather over the last couple of days and all your friends and family are safe. I guess a bit of a reminder about why we do what we do. Anyway, so today's seminar is 15 years of recovery or lack thereof of the Christchurch Earthquakes, and it's presented by Ilan and Olga Filippova. So Ilan is the chair in the Economics of Disasters and Climate Change at Aotearoa University in Wellington, and a professor of applied economics at the Gran Sasso Science Institute in Italy. His research and teaching focused on economics of natural hazards and disasters and climate change. Ilan's also a program area leader for DT3, the Law, Planning and Economics. And Ilan's presenting alongside Olga Filippova, who's also co-lead of DT3 and also newly appointed Associate Director for QuakeCoRE. Olga is an associate professor in the Department of Property at University of Auckland, and her research sits at the intersection of the physical and financial dimensions of the built environment, with a particular focus on how property market participants perceive and respond to natural hazard risks. So before I hand over to Ilan and Olga, I just wanted to remind everyone to please keep your mics off until the Q&A session at the end. The seminar is being recorded. If you would like to ask any questions, you can jot them down in the chat as we go along. And or when we get to question time, you can use the raise your hand function within Zoom and ask the question at the end. Right, so I will hand over to Ilan.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thanks Olga for collaborating with me on this. What we will do is I will briefly talk a little bit about the sort of the big picture macroeconomics of the Canterbury region, and then I will hand over to Olga to talk a little bit more in detail within the Canterbury region, and then Olga will hand it back to me to talk about what happened to, as far as we know in terms of the research, what happened to individuals within the city of Christchurch in the aftermath of the earthquake. We're mostly thinking about the earthquake in 2011, February 2011, but of course we all understand that this was a sequence of earthquakes that started in September 2010. Olga, next, please.
Okay.
Yeah, so just a few slides about what happened in terms of the macroeconomic aggregates in the region. So this is just a slide of the population, the working age population in each of the regions, the main regions in New Zealand, with one denoting, where they were in 2009 and what happened to them in the aftermath of sort of from 2009 onward. So what you can see here, if you can see colors, and I can't, but what you can, I think, see here is that Canterbury is not really an outlier in terms of what happened to its population in the last 15 years. It's sort of in the middle of the pack. Some regions grew faster than Canterbury, but it's not as though there's anything particularly noticeable for Canterbury during this period, except maybe in the period just 2011 and 2012. You can see that Canterbury is supposed to be the very bottom line there, because there was a decline in population in Canterbury, which is of course unusual in the New Zealand context. Next. So this is what happened to employment in Canterbury. So the top 5 sectors in terms of the number of employees in Canterbury, and here we start to see some unusual things going on. Not terribly surprising. The construction sector boomed meaning it doubled between 2011 and 2015. So in 2011, it was about 15,000 before the earthquakes, and by 2014, it's at around 30,000. The other sector that seems to boom is professional, scientific, and technical services, A lot of that boom is also associated with the construction boom in Christchurch after the earthquake. So these are a lot of, architects and lawyers and bankers and insurance brokers and all of these people who are serving the construction sector and the construction boom that is happening in the city of Christchurch. If you look at the other big employers in the city, they don't change that much. They are all increasing because population is increasing, but they don't also decline, which is maybe one of the piece of good news in the sort of the decade after the earthquake. Next, please. So if we look at what happened to gross regional product, which is the regional version of gross domestic product, GDP, just measured at the regional level. So here we are just comparing Canterbury to the North Island and to Otago, the other big important region in the South Island. You can see that something different is happening in Canterbury in the years after the earthquake. So Canterbury is booming after the earthquake in terms of its GRP, but eventually the other regions catch up with it. So today, 15 years after the earthquake, Canterbury is sort of where the other regions are the same. So while there was a higher growth rate in the immediate sort of 5 years after the earthquake, later on it slowed down in Canterbury and sped up elsewhere in the North Island and the South Island. Next, please. That you went back.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, that's front. Thank you. This is where we start to get, I think, interesting observations. So this is the various sectors in Canterbury relative to the rest of New Zealand. So not surprisingly, we see a huge boom in the construction sector that peaks around to 2015, but it sort of withers away after 2015, and it's almost back to where it would have been relative to the other areas in other regions in New Zealand. It's maybe about 10% bigger now than other areas in New Zealand relative to where it was in 2009. The same is true for the professional sector. Again, the same sector that sort of provides services to the construction sector. But, and I think this is the most important observation here, we see some sectors that are losing relative to the rest of New Zealand. So if you look at IT or hospitality and accommodation, they're losing against the rest of New Zealand. So they're about 10% lower now relative to the rest of New Zealand than where they were in 2009. And that is a worrying observation, because we all understand that the trend that construction and professional are moving towards is getting back to sort of pre-earthquake or what is else in New Zealand, but we don't see the similar. We see that these other sectors seems to have a persistent loss that started after the earthquake and they haven't recovered from. And we're not sure when and if they will. Next, please. And I think that's over to you.
Yes, thank you, Ilan. So I'm looking more at within Canterbury region, and to start off, just looking at the population growth within the region, I've looked at the urban areas, and we can see that there is definitely one area of Canterbury that stands out is Ralston, and the population growth in that suburb has been absolutely exponential and went up from 5,000 people in 2006 up to nearly 30,000 in the latest census. Another area to watch is Lincoln, which has also grown quite significantly, whereas Christchurch kind of has experienced some growth and regained population loss after the earthquakes, but it hasn't even kept up with the national rate of population growth. And you have other couple areas within Waimakariri district in Canterbury, Rangiora, and Kaiapoi, also experiencing growth, but certainly nothing like what we're seeing in Selwyn district within Ralston and Lincoln areas. So now, of course, all of this population growth has to be supported by construction, residential construction, and we can see that clearly there is a lot of activity that's been happening in Ralston to kind of accommodate all of the new people that are going in that area. And you can see in the aerial images here on your right that in just a 10-year period, how much construction has happened in that suburb. There is, of course, dwellings being built in Lincoln and the 4 avenues is I'm looking at the Christchurch CBD defined by those 4 avenues. But again, we're seeing Rolleston as being an outperformer out of the other areas in kind of Christchurch and nearby surrounding areas. Now, why do people go into Canterbury? And one thing that is obvious, I think, is what is still driving a lot of homeowners is this quarter-acre dream. And in Auckland, this quarter-acre dream has become highly unattainable. And we can see from the graphs of the dwelling sale prices that Canterbury in general has been more affordable than Auckland. And so that is one clearly attractive factor that drives people into the region. And especially during the post-GFC recovery, we have experienced some rising house prices, but you can see that at that time, especially Canterbury has been quite still an affordable area to go into. And as what I refer to is quarter-acre dream, which pretty much is not available in Auckland these days, where the market is dominated by supply and just terrace houses, and so medium and high density dwellings. On the other hand, the dream of, okay, we may have to downsize from a quarter-acre to maybe 1/8 of an acre dream, but you can still get a patch of grass in Ralston. And you can see that in terms of the dwelling types that are being supplied into the market is dominated by houses. So you can still buy a house and live still kind of close to a main urban city in New Zealand. Whereas looking at the 4 avenues within Christchurch city centre, the trend is obviously reverse of what we see in the suburb of Christchurch, where the construction is dominated by townhouses and apartments. But of course, given that there is the city centre, you're not going to see a lot of standalone dwellings in there. So you can see that you can afford, it's more affordable, and it supplies what people still want and dream of. In terms of rents, it's actually it's also marginally more affordable than Auckland, but interestingly, after the earthquakes, you can see that rents actually has increased within Canterbury at a much higher rate than in Auckland, but that has kind of subsided since then. And also in terms of the investment into the Canterbury market, if you see on the lower graph in the change in house sale prices, we can see that actually Canterbury region post kind of our COVID market peak, it has performed for investors, it has performed better, and it seems to be like that's a more better performing market than Auckland. So from investment perspective, it is an attractive place to invest. So other things I looked at is the employment growth within the region. And as you have seen, the high number increase in population within Ralston, actually, there has only been not only the growth in population, but also employment growth. So they have created new jobs within that suburb. And you probably have seen on the news things like the warehouse has their South Island distribution center in Ralston, and just last month, Pack and Safe opened their biggest supermarket in the South Island. So there are things that are extremely attractive both to people to live in, but also for new industries to locate and create new jobs. Whereas if you look at Lincoln, it has had a lot of new construction happening and a new flow of residential population, but that hasn't been supported by the growth in job creations. And the 4 avenues, which is the main kind of employer within this Christchurch, the number of employees still is below what we have seen the numbers before the earthquakes. I've also looked at where do people commute to work. So the orange tables represent kind of main employment centers within Canterbury region, or really Christchurch and Waimakariri and Selwyn districts. And also where do people travel from into those main employment centers. These are in the tables in the blue. So I've looked at these are not actual distance traveled by road. These are just distances calculated from centroids of statistical areas. And then accumulated those kind of kilometers traveled by total number of people of working population. So you can see it's kind of not unusual trend that most of the kilometers are in 2018 and in 2023 are going towards kind of your main employment centers within Christchurch City. So your kind of industrial areas, airport, and of course the city center. Whereas where do people travel from to those workplaces? Again, you can see that it's actually dominated by places like Ralston and Waimakariri district. And I guess one thing I wanted to highlight in this section is that when Christchurch was being rebuilt, one of the aspirations was that people will be actually traveling less and they'll be living where they're working. But you can see that there is an increase in the kilometers traveled, and people are traveling from outside suburbs into the city center, and not as much travel happening within the city of Christchurch. Now I want to zoom in into the 4 avenues, and I've actually noticed quite a few articles being published in the media about how vibrant Christchurch has become. And just last month, I think the Paddy Gower, he asked, how good is Christchurch? Well, it is absolutely the best city in New Zealand in his assessment. And a lot of people would agree. If you go into the city center, it's vibrant. There is the riverside market. You can sit on the steps of the river and, you know, have your lunch. It's a nice and attractive area. You have all the anchor projects being finally completed. So yes, on the surface, it seems like the city center is certainly kind of showing strong signs of recovery. However, if you look deeper inside, it is a place that you would like to visit, but it seems that it's still not a place that where people want to live. And the 4 avenues are still dominated by vacant sites, and around 20% of the land in the city center is still vacant. And a few struggling projects within the barrier sites program that the Christchurch City Council has initiated back in 2017, when they came out with a list of 30 sites where buildings were in quite poor condition since the earthquakes, or the building was demolished, but the foundation was still kind of sitting on the site, becoming a natural pool and nesting habitats for birds. So there is still a few of those projects kind of struggling and reminding people that the city actually hasn't fully recovered. And you can see that, you know, Christchurch city center, even before the earthquakes, if you look at the 10-year composition within the city center, I mean, it was always dominated by people who weren't staying there very long, and not a lot has changed in terms of that tenure profile, even in the last census. It's still mostly investor-owned stock and occupied by renters, and more so by temporary accommodation through sites like Airbnb. You can see that the dominance of Airbnb stock within the 4 avenues is just completely kind of, if you look at other markets in New Zealand, it's several times more than what it is. So a lot of new housing that's being supplied into the city center goes to rental stock. And you can see, because of course you're competing with likes of Ralston, that can offer that quarter acre dream, and on the other hand, what is being supplied into the city center is still not what people want to buy and live there long term. So yes, you can see that region-wise, there's been a lot of standout areas, but there are still things that where we need to invest more and think about how those are recovering, especially within the city center. And so with that, I'm giving it back the mic to Ilan.
Thank you. So I will start with some insights from looking at the integrated data infrastructure, which is the most boring name for the most sinister database that New Zealand has. This is Big Brother. It has information about all of you, all of us. And we're fortunate to have access to it so we can practice being Big Brother in the sort of 1984 sense rather than the reality TV sense, and look at what happened to people in Christchurch after the earthquake. So I'm going to show you a few pieces of research that we've done over the last few years. Or most of them with two PhD students actually funded by QuakeCoRE. Toa Huang, who was funded by QuakeCoRE in phase 1, and Yusuf Abdel Jawad, who was funded, who's just defending his doctorate in a couple of weeks. Next. So this is based on two papers that I did with Yusuf, which might be the only two papers in New Zealand written by an Israeli and a Palestinian about New Zealand. And in this crazy time, this is an achievement. This looks at what happened to income, individual income in the years after the earthquake. And what we find is actually maybe not surprising given what I've shown you before, is that the income of people who work in construction has increased a lot after the earthquake. So a very significant increase in income for construction workers. We haven't seen much difference or much change in incomes for people who work in other sectors in the economy. In a few cases, we've seen some declines, but very minor and not statistically significant. Basically, the only big difference is in the construction sector, a boom, but a boom that didn't last, and you've seen that in the macroeconomic pictures as well. So by 2018, 2019, the incomes of construction workers sort of went back down. It's no longer was unusually high as it was in the years following the earthquake. Next. Together with Yusuf, we also looked at migration. So who migrated and to where? And we have looked both in sort of short-term migration, so migration within the 3 years after the earthquake, and also longer term. So whether people stayed away all the way to, I believe, 2019. Basically assuming that by 2020, everything else has changed because of the pandemic. So we didn't look beyond 2019. And we do find some interesting patterns. So in terms of out-migration from Christchurch, not surprisingly, construction workers didn't out-migrate, though actually there was an in-migration of construction workers, although we didn't look at in-migration. But basically, if you were a construction worker before the earthquake, you were much less likely to migrate out of Christchurch than other people. We do see that the more educated were less likely to migrate out, especially people with secondary education. We see increases in out-migration for people without secondary education and people with tertiary education. So both ends of the education sort of, they did see, and we see some increase in terms of sort of Asians were less likely to migrate, but Asians are not a very big community in Canterbury. And the young were less likely to migrate, and the old were much more likely to migrate. So we have seen a significant increase in the number of older people meaning myself and up, basically, who've actually increased migration. This is all relative to other areas in New Zealand. right? So, and not surprisingly, the young people had a lot of job opportunities in sectors like construction. So we see this pattern of demographic change in terms of the ages in the city. Next. Mental health. We can also follow mental health looking at prescriptions for anti-anxiety and antidepressants. And here we see a large increase in the number of prescriptions for antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication. This is, again, we see an increase everywhere actually in all high-income countries. But this is increasing Christchurch relative to other places in New Zealand. So we see a larger increase in Christchurch than in other places in New Zealand. I think this is related to the earthquake and to sort of the aftermath of the earthquake and the difficulties that people experienced after the earthquake. But this, worryingly, is long lasting, and we still see that in 2019. Next, please. Yusuf also looked at offending in Christchurch. A lot of times after disasters, there's a very significant fear of breakdown in social order and increase in crime. Most research globally have found decreases in crime after disasters rather than increases in crime, and it's not Christchurch follows the same pattern. There's a decrease in all kinds of crime in Christchurch. Here we are just looking at young males. Why? Because young males are most of the offenders. Pretty much for any kind of offense, young males have much higher rates of offending. But we have looked also at older males, younger females, whatever. We can look at everyone. As I told you, it's Big Brother. But the only kind of offense you see an increase of in the year of the earthquake is traffic offense. This is probably people just getting confused about all the traffic, rerouting and everything that was going on in Christchurch at the time, and maybe getting a little bit upset about that. But otherwise, other than that, we see a decrease in offending in Christchurch that again lasts all the whole decade, basically. Next, please. We have a little bit of research on the red zone in Christchurch, so specifically on the red zone. Here we are not comparing Christchurch to other places in New Zealand, but rather comparing the people who are in the red zone, in the residential red zone, so those people who were moved, relative to other people in Christchurch similarly affected by the earthquake. We find a few interesting things that I can just briefly mention. People in the residential red zone were given a choice between whether they will get compensation from the government or whether they will get compensation from insurers. We know that people made the wrong choice, meaning they were paid less than they could have been paid if they made the other choice. And we could show that in the data. And we can also show that they made the wrong choice because their neighbors made the wrong choice. So this is a lot of sort of peer effect and people asking other neighbors, what did you choose between the insurers and the government, and people making the wrong choices there. We also know that that choice mattered for people. People who chose insurance were less happy with the process, generally. And we know that too many people chose to go with insurers, and they were unhappy with the process. So that has implications for policy, of course. We also looked at incomes, and if you look at slice the population in whichever way, there's one population that kind of seemed to have lost income because of the if they were in the residential red zone, and that's young women. Exactly why we don't know, and we are actually have follow-up projects to try to understand exactly what happened there. We think it has to do with care for dependents, but we're not sure that this is the case. We just observe in the data that there's lower income for young women who were in the residential red zone relative to other young women in other areas of Christchurch. We also look at mental health. There is a spike for everyone who is in the residential red zone in terms of for every kind of group, whatever age, whatever education, whatever gender. Short-term spike in the use of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. There's only one group for which this persists over time, and that's the elderly. So for the elderly, we see a persistent increased use of antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication, again, that goes all the way to 2019.
Ilan, if you could just wrap up in the next couple of minutes.
Yes, I think I have one or two slides and that's it. I will just briefly mention we used some satellite data on nightlights to look at what insurance did and how people paid for insurance, how people got compensated for damage to their houses, and how that had implications for the both for the economic recovery and for the property markets. But I'm not going to tell you what the results are because I don't have time. And then next slide. This is something I wrote in 2012, and I thought it's kind of interesting. So I came to New Zealand at the end of 2011. And in 2012, I was asked to write, what I thought about the way the recovery in Christchurch is going. And somewhat cutely, I said that it's going too slowly. And it's a bit silly that I said that in 2012, and now we're in 2025 and it's still ongoing. But I was worried about that, and I was worried about the fact that it's going too slowly because at the time I was researching two events that happened in the 1990s, the earthquake in Kobe in 1995 and the hurricane in Kauai in Hawaii in 1992. There were different patterns in those two places. In Kobe, in both places, you saw a decrease in the demand for employees. So labor markets were depressed, but the reaction to that depressed labor markets was different in the long term in Kobe and in Kauai. In Kauai, people just migrated away, so there was a loss of population. But in terms of income, people's income recovered because once people moved away, there was enough jobs for everyone. In Kobe, it was exactly the opposite. The opposite, people did not migrate away, and because of that, there was a persistent decreased income in the city, which we observed 15 years later in the case of Kobe. So population didn't recover population declined in Kauai, but incomes recovered. In Kobe, it's exactly the opposite. Population didn't decline at all, but income declined. And I was worried that Christchurch will end up being like Kauai, where people will move away. And if anything, if I had to guess right now, and I would say that the example of Kobe is actually more appropriate to what is going to be happening in Christchurch. The one big difference is in Kobe, they finished the reconstruction in 5 years. In Christchurch, it's going to take longer than that. And I think I will end there. Right, Olga? That's it. Yep.
Thanks so much, Ilan and Olga.